Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to D.G. Will's Books in La Jolla, California. Tonight we're honored to have renowned author Lawrence Goldstone, who will read from and discuss his book, Not White Enough, The Long, Shameful Road to Japanese-American Internment. Lawrence Goldstone is the author or co-author of more than a dozen books, including The Activist, John Marshall, Marbury versus Madison, and The Myth of Judicial Review, as well as On Account of Race, the Supreme Court, White Supremacy, and the Ravaging of African American Voting Rights. His work has been profiled in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the Toronto Star, Salon, Slate, and elsewhere. Lawrence Goldstone's Not White Enough is a comprehensive examination of a century of bigotry against Chinese and Japanese Americans that culminated in the infamous Supreme Court decision, Korematsu versus United States. The landmark ruling that upheld the illegal imprisonment of more than 100,000 innocent men, women, and children who were falsely accused of endangering national security during World War II. Goldstone also examines other Supreme Court decisions, highlighting the key roles that were played by San Francisco mayors, a California Attorney General, as well as a future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in instigating some of the most egregious anti-Asian laws. Goldstone also illustrates Chinese and Japanese immigrants' courage and determination to carve out a place for themselves in a country that did everything it could to reject them. Ladies and gentlemen, Lawrence Goldstone.
Thank you all for being here. I love this store. When I first walked in here with Margaret, I said, if I'm going to give a talk, this is the place I want to do it. Nancy and I, my wife, wrote a number of books on antiquarian books and used bookstores, and this is the kind of place we used to haunt. We just came in and there's row after row, shelves, treasures, books that you never thought you'd see, books you never thought you'd see again. I mean, it's just very cool. But this store is even more cool because when you walk in the back over there, there are still pictures of one of my favorite movies when I was growing up, Mr. Roberts, with Henry Fonda and Jack Lemmon in his Oscar-nominated role, an aging William Powell, Lee Marvin in a small role, and James Cagney playing the evil captain. James Cagney went to my high school, by the way, a couple of years before I did. But then in addition, there are other still photographs of one of my other favorite films, Lost Horizon, with a dashing Ronald Colman, pictures of him are everywhere, Jane Wyatt playing the ingenue before she was the mother on Father Knows Best, H.B. Warner, who also played the druggist who poisoned the child in It's a Wonderful Life, and Sam Jaffe playing the 130-year-old priest, either immediately before or immediately after he had played the 17-year-old Gunga Din. Now that's character acting. In any event, while I could talk about movie trivia for hours, I suspect, at least hope, that's not why you're here. So we're going to talk a little bit about history. And I am what is called a narrative historian, which means that I don't look at incidents in a vacuum, but I think things all happen for a reason. So you have to look at the surrounding political and economic and social issues. You have to look at the history. You have to really get a sense of the personalities involved. I've written on any number of subjects, as Dennis indicated. I've written on early aviation, I've written on automobiles, I've written on submarines, written on rare books, I've written on Copernicus, baseball. I wrote about the Yankees. I'm from Brooklyn, I was a trader. But most of my work is about the Supreme Court, constitutional history, and equal rights. I've written a number of books on that subject, and Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates, is kind of a friend of mine, and he asked me once, he said, how come you're always writing about black people, you know, being white? And I said, and this is totally true, I have always hated bullies. I hate them in the schoolyard, I hate them in Congress, I hate them on the bench, I hate them everywhere, and that is a good incentive to find things to write about. And one of the ways I can do that is I look at egregious Supreme Court decisions. Just to give you a sense, about a dozen years ago, I was going to look at Plessy versus Ferguson, which is the Supreme Court decision in 1896. It was an 8-1 decision that justified the separate but equal segregation, that if facilities are equal, they can be separate. Of course, the facilities never were equal. So I'm looking at Plessy and I go, well, the story doesn't really start there. You got to go back a little, and you have to go back at least to 1890 when Mississippi became the first state of the old Confederacy to rewrite its constitution specifically to disenfranchise black people. And then the story didn't really start there either. Got to go back at least to 1883 when the Supreme Court, again by an 8-1 decision, ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was the most comprehensive civil rights law at the time and maybe in history, that was unconstitutional. And that takes you back to 1875. And then eventually I realized you can't do that story without going all the way back to just after the Civil War and at least 1868 and the ratification of the 14th Amendment. And then I moved forward and I realized the story didn't end with Plessy, but went at least to 1903 and another horrific Supreme Court decision, Giles v. Harris, in which Oliver Wendell Holmes, in his first opinion, wrote it in such a way that actually hammered the last nail in any hope of equal rights for black people, and that did hearken in Jim Crow and decades of slavery and everything but name. Now, for this book, I was drawn to Korematsu, as Dennis said, Korematsu versus United States, which is it also goes down in history as one of the worst decisions that the Supreme Court ever rendered. But what's interesting to me about Korematsu was that two of the men in the majority, William O. Douglas and Hugo Black, who would later become known as two of the Supreme Court's great civil libertarians in their history, voted in the majority. And not only did they vote in the majority, but Hugo Black wrote the majority opinion. And I thought there must be a story here. There must be a reason why these two men, the last two people you would think would render such a horribly racist decision, at least as adults. Black was from Alabama. He had been in the Klan as a younger man, but he had left all that behind. There must be a reason. So in the same methodology that I used in Inherently Unequal, which was my book about Plessy, I go back a little, and of course Pearl Harbor, but it goes back before that, and Japanese militarism in the 1930s, and it goes back before that, and it goes back at least to the turn of the 20th century when Japanese immigration started in great numbers. And then I realized the story didn't start there either, but was the second chapter of a story that began with bigotry against Chinese immigrants, and that takes you all the way back to the gold rush. And so in most scholarship, you will see focus either on Chinese exclusion or Japanese internment. But to me, this was not two stories, this was one story. And it was kind of stitched together relatively seamlessly around the turn of the 20th century when Japanese immigration started in earnest. And so, so you're looking for common threads. And one of the common threads in both stories is the struggle for citizenship, the struggle to become an American citizen. Now, citizenship in 1787, national citizenship, when the Constitution was written, was a very hazy concept. There was no sense of real national citizenship. Almost every person in America thought of him or herself as a citizen of the state in which they lived first, and only a citizen of this kind of vague notion of the United States second. And as a result, there is almost no mention of national citizenship in the Constitution. The only places it's mentioned are you had to be a citizen of the United States for 7 years to be elected to the House of Representatives, for 9 years to be elected to the Senate, and a citizen for 14 years to be elected president. Interestingly enough, when the first draft of that came out, it was not citizen of the United States, but citizen in the United States, meaning that the people who were drafting the Constitution recognized that state citizenship was actually the most important. Because national citizenship, okay, you have to be a citizen of the United States for 9 years in 1788 to be elected to the Senate. but the country wasn't actually technically founded until 1781 when the Articles of Confederation were adopted. There was no United States 9 years before the first Congress was elected. So this sense of national citizenship was extremely hazy. One more little note. To be a justice of the Supreme Court, which is the only court mentioned in Article 3, there is no citizenship requirement at all. Technically speaking, if Vladimir Putin was nominated to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to replace John Roberts, let's not give anyone any ideas though, and the Senate approved the nomination, Vladimir Putin is technically qualified to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I will take that one no further. That although the notion of citizenship was very hazy, there had to be some accommodation for all the people that the founders wanted and expected to come into the country. There was vast Western lands to be populated. They needed it for national defense, the economy. So there had to be some kind of sense of how you become a naturalized American citizen. So the Constitution does authorize Congress to create a uniform rule of naturalization, which they did in 1790. And broad-minded as these delegates and the first congressmen were, they restricted naturalization, the ability to be naturalized, to free white persons of good character. Now, that was free white. It was free white persons, but in effect, it was only men, just about, because very few women who arrived in the country on their own were allowed to apply for citizenship. It was a very odd arrangement because there was no federal bureau enforcing this rule. So every state had the opportunity to decide who was white, who was free, and who was of good character. And this would cause a lot of problems later. That situation lasted and would be used by people like Boss Tweed in New York to kind of fill the Democratic Party, of which he was a leader, with immigrants, and then ultimately there would be national standards. Now, free white persons obviously meant to exclude black people. Now, there was no question that no person who was enslaved could become a citizen, but what about free blacks? Well, that question was answered in 1857 when Roger Brooke Tawney and Dred Scott v. Sanford ruled that not only could no enslaved person of color become a citizen, but no free person of color could be a citizen. And that, of course, was going to be overruled by the 14th Amendment 11 years later. And it's funny, Tawney rendered the decision because President Buchanan had been putting pressure on him to come up with a decision to help avert a civil war, and instead he kind of helped start one. Now, Asian immigrants from Asia were something of an afterthought. After the gold rush, there were about 20,000 immigrants from China that poured into the West in the first few years. But they were kind of lost in the tens and tens of thousands of people who came all over the world trying to get rich. Now, most of the Chinese came here, the economic conditions were bad. They came here with the idea that they would make some money in the gold fields and then go back home and as wealthy people. But very quickly, gold got scarce, competition got very intense, and the Chinese were among the first, because they looked different, Chinese and Mexicans were among the first that the white miners decided they should not be in the gold fields. And with laws and taxes and a lot of violence, the Chinese were quickly shunted off the gold fields. Some of them went to work in agriculture, some on the railroad, but most of them gravitated to the cities. And largely in San Francisco, which at the time, it was a boom town. It had gone from 800 people to 25,000 in 2 years. And the Chinese settled in an enclave, which later became Chinatown, and they either went to work for white employers, or they were very entrepreneurial. They started their own businesses. Laundering, for example, was considered women's work, and men wouldn't wash their own clothes, but most of the men had come unaccompanied. So the Chinese filled that niche, and pretty soon they dominated the laundry business. Now, most of the Chinese immigrants were lived in very terrible conditions, substandard, crowded, overcrowded. The Chinese who worked for the white employers, they worked longer hours at much worse conditions, and for low pay. So you had two kinds of prejudice that came into play there. There was just your basic garden variety racial prejudice, of which there was a ton, but then there was an economic question, because there was a nascent union movement, and the unions loathed the Chinese because they were willing to work longer hours and worse conditions for a lot less money. So what ultimately happened is it became enormous pressure to stanch the flow of Chinese immigration. Now, some of these Chinese merchants made a lot of money. They were extremely entrepreneurial, very sophisticated, very smart, and the merchants who made a lot of money formed themselves into these kind of loosely knit consortium that later became known as the Six Companies. And what the Six Companies did, and so there were a number of ordinances, taxes, trying to make it difficult for the Chinese, trying to get them to go home, trying to make sure that no more Chinese came to the United States. And the Six Companies, what they did was they fought these ordinances by going out and hiring the best white lawyers, and they had a remarkable record of success in getting many of these ordinances overturned, and many others just rendered moot. So you have this situation where the unions and just white supremacists are loathing the Chinese, and the more successful the Six Companies became at making Chinatown a functioning part of society, the more they wanted to get rid of them. And pressure was brought to bear, and in 1875, a California congressman named Horace Page was instrumental in getting the Page Act passed, which said that no Chinese laborer who was already under contract to work could enter the United States, nor could Chinese women, which he had said were all prostitutes. And the Page Act was the very first law that specifically restricted an ethnic or racial group from entering the United States. That kind of worked, but it didn't work enough. So in 1882, again, with Horace Page honchoing the bill, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and that didn't allow Chinese laborers, which is how they define just about everybody, into the country, and it stanched Chinese immigration for until well into the 20th century. Between those two laws, however, there was a very interesting court case. The Six Companies found a Chinese laborer named Ah Yup and backed a lawsuit. And the lawsuit said that Ah Yup was in fact technically white. Just that he was pale-skinned, and they took that to court. And that in fact, so Chinese immigrants were allowed to apply for citizenship because they were not in violation of the Naturalization Act of 1790, and then there were subsequent ones as well. And I went before a judge named Lorenzo Sawyer. And Sawyer was a pretty fair guy. He wasn't going to make this ruling just based on racial grounds. What he did was decided to learn the science. You know, everybody is saying, learn the science. Well, he went to learn the science. Unfortunately, back in 1878, the science of ethnology wasn't exactly what you would call like particle physics. It was quack science, and the main authority was a German by the name of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who studied skulls. He studied 5 sets of skulls and decided that there was a racial hierarchy to be gleaned from the study of these skulls. And in an extraordinary surprise, at the top of this hierarchy were Caucasians. And in another stunning surprise, at the bottom of the pyramid were Ethiopians, which is what he called black people. Immediately above Ethiopians were Red Indians, as he called them, Native Americans, and up one rung were Mongolians, which is what he called anyone from Asia. So Sawyer studied it in good faith and said, nope, Ayup is not eligible. Ayup is not white. He is Mongolian, and therefore neither he nor any other immigrant from China can apply to be naturalized. And this kind of created a status quo. There was a lot of push and pull, a lot of laws. There were other cases, Yickwo v. Hopkins, which I saw Tom Hanks cite in Bill of Spies, which we don't have time for. But it looked like the white supremacists and the Union people were successful because there were very few Chinese women, and so the number of Chinese stayed relatively static. But unfortunately, there turned out to be a problem for all these white people, and it was that old pesky 14th Amendment, which said that anyone born in the United States was a citizen of the United States and the state in which he or she was born, which is the first mention of national citizenship in the Constitution, I believe. And now there were only about 1,000 native-born Chinese Americans at the time because there were no women. But one of them was named Wong Kim Ark. And Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco in 1870 or 1871. In 1890, he went back to China, evidently got married, came back into this country, showed his papers. He was natural born. They let him in. Went back again 2 years later to visit, evidently, his son. So he was not idle during the first trip. And this time, the customs inspector said, nope, I'm not letting you in. You're not white. You're Chinese, and he was a cook. So he fell into the laborer category. And he said, I'm a citizen. I was born here. Has all his papers. But the inspector would not let him in. They kept him in a boat in San Francisco Harbor for 7 or 8 months. And the 6 companies took up the case. And they brought it to it ended up in the Supreme Court. United States versus Wong Kim Ark. Now, everyone expected, and this test of birthright citizenship, is in fact a person born here of parents who are, quote, ineligible for citizenship, can that person be covered by the 14th Amendment? Now, everybody in the West expected, and most of the country expected the court to rule, no, Wong's not a citizen. The 14th Amendment is of limited reach, and they'd find some judicial hook to hang a racial decision on. But in a stunning upset, the Supreme Court, with Horace Gray writing the decision, said no, the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship is inviolate, and Wong is in fact a citizen and had to be let back into the United States. Now, if you read a lot of articles on the Wong case, they say this was a victory for equal rights. Hooey! It wasn't a victory for equal rights at all, because if you go into Gray's opinion, what he said was, well, if we disallow Wong's citizenship, we will also be disallowing the tens of thousands of native-born Americans from the good countries, which meant Northern Europe, and we're not willing to do that. He didn't put it in those terms, but that's basically what he said, because the Chinese, quote, problem was not really a big deal in the East where all this was taking place, but immigration from Germany and Scandinavia and the British Isles, that was a big deal. So Wong, birthright citizenship is now established for anyone born here, which didn't seem to matter a whole lot because there were so few Chinese women. That's about the time when Japanese immigration started in earnest. And it started for the same reason. People came here for, for a better life, to seek employment, to try to do a little bit better than they did at home, because for many people in Japan, economic conditions were not particularly good. So the Japanese start to get here, and they are initially, they're even kind of accepted, because if you read the newspaper articles, now the one other thing I would say is the two major newspaper magnates at the time, V.S. McClatchy and William Randolph Hearst, were both hideously racist, and just for decades and decades and decades, until way till after Pearl Harbor, they were putting out the most scurrilous article about first the Chinese and then the Japanese. But at this time, you read and they say, well, the Japanese are actually better, they're more cultured. And the other thing about the Japanese were the Japanese immigrants wanted to assimilate. They came here wanting to be Americans, where the Chinese had formed into this enclave. But that didn't last a whole long time, because the unions were obviously ferociously against Japanese immigration, because all of a sudden there's this new pool of cheap labor. So they fought it tooth and nail. And in San Francisco, the union movement had become incredibly powerful in San Francisco. And at just about the time that Japanese immigration had started in larger numbers, the union movement boiled over. The unions got together. They basically shut the city down. The port was closed. The employers dug in. They hired scabs. They hired police officers. There was violence. There were all sorts of incidents with brick throwing, and ultimately the employers actually won out. But during this period, the Democrats and the Republicans, it was a mayoral election, and the Democrats and the Republicans each put up some lackluster candidate, because it didn't make a whole lot of difference. Although anyone running for mayor had to do it on an anti-Japanese platform. The union people decided we need a political party of our own, and they formed the Union Labor Party. And the first meetings of the Union Labor Party were kind of like those movies where you see where a lot of people gather around a table and throw food at each other, because there was no organization. Everybody, I was in the peace movement, and it's kind of reminded me of those meetings. Everybody thought they were the big cheese, and everybody wanted to be the leader, and everybody had a different idea, and it went nowhere. Until one day, a man walked into one of the meetings. And this man was was destined to become one of the most exceptional and unique political bosses in American history. I'd say one of the most corrupt, but there were so many, but he's up there. And his name was Abe Rueff, R-U-E-F. Used to be R-U-E-F-F. He dropped the second F. Abe Rueff was extremely cultured. He spoke languages. He had gone to Berkeley. He knew music. And what made him very special was that he was Jewish, which is a very unusual thing for political bosses at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And Abe Rueff had started in politics wanting to be a reformer. And he even was corresponding with another reformer in New York, another young man who wanted to clean up corruption, and that was Teddy Roosevelt. Abe Rueff walks into a Union Labor Party meeting and sees the chaos and makes the decision, probably on the spot, that he would rather be rich and corrupt than idealistic and poor. And he set himself to take over the Union Labor Party, which he did. He was smart, he was articulate, he gave him a platform, he balanced all of these warring union leaders, and he convinced them that what they needed to do was to run a candidate for mayor against these two other Tweedledum and Tweedledee Republican and Democratic candidates. And who did he pick? Well, he picked a violinist named Eugene Schmitz, violinist and orchestra leader. Eugene Schmitz was tall, dapper, handsome Gene, they called him. The only problem with Schmitz was Schmitz had no real interest in politics. He had never been involved in politics. He had no real interest in becoming involved in politics. But Royf charmed him and convinced him that being mayor of San Francisco might be better than, playing a violin at a bar mitzvah. And they run. Nobody assumes that Union Labor Party is going to do anything, but they win. And Eugene Schmitz becomes the mayor of San Francisco. Abe Royf becomes the power behind the throne. He surrounds himself with like-minded thieves, which the newspapers called the Boodle Boys, and they proceed to rob the city 10 ways from Sunday. There was not one transaction that went by without Royf or his cronies getting a cut. They took a cut of permits. They took a cut of every application of everything. They took money from businesses. They took money from the French restaurants, which was the euphemism for brothels. But Royf was really smart, and he made sure that the working people got paid more. The working people loved him. The working people got paid more than they had ever gotten paid before. And he also cultivated the police. So by 1905, it appeared that Royf was just going to be invulnerable. Two of San Francisco's leading citizens, Fremont Older and Rudolph Spreckels, and Spreckels, you see, the name is common even down here, go to Washington and meet with Royf's old correspondent, Teddy Roosevelt, and tells him, you got to do something. And Roosevelt, after hearing the horror stories, assigns Francis Heaney, a U.S. attorney, and William J. Burns, known as the American Sherlock Holmes. He wasn't, but he did found the William Burns Detective Agency, to go to San Francisco and clean up the mess. So Burns's operatives start nosing around, but he can't make any headway. Royf owns the town. He owns the police. Nobody is going to talk to him. It's a very frustrating endeavor. Looks like it will go nowhere. And then all of a sudden, nature intervened. And San Francisco had an earthquake. And this earthquake, in two ways, changed everything. The first way was, the earthquake, there was a lot of destruction, but most of the destruction came in the fires 2 and 3 days afterwards. And one of the areas of the city that was burned to the ground was Chinatown. And Abe Royf looked at Chinatown and went, this is really good property. I think we should have it. And he puts together a consortium, and they all put in money, and they're going to get all the Chinatown property. The Chinese were supposed to be shunted off to Hunter's Point, which is a spit of land out in San Francisco Bay, swampy area. And Royf, they were all going to make millions. Unfortunately for Royf and the Boodle Boys, the Chinese proved to be a good deal more sophisticated than he gave them credit for. They were in 3 ways. Number one, the Chinese embassy was located in Chinatown, and that was technically the property of the Chinese government. And a small but significant area in Chinatown was actually owned by Chinese owners. And there was a city ordinance said, if you own the property and the building is destroyed, you can rebuild instantly. You don't have to wait for permits. And so that's what they did. They started rebuilding. And for the majority of the area where the Chinese were leasing from white owners, the leaders of the 6 companies said, go and renew your lease. Doesn't matter what they charge you. We will make up the difference. Just don't let them turn you down. And so all of a sudden, it appears that Chinatown isn't going anywhere. And although this was not fatal to Royf, it punctured that air of invulnerability. There was one other thing. One of the things that happens in an earthquake is a lot of things get broken. And one of the things that got broken in this earthquake was a safe. And inside that safe were a lot of papers. And unfortunately for Royf, Burns' men stumbled on these papers, and what they contained were details of a series of extremely dirty deals. One was you had to renew your liquor license every 3 months in San Francisco. And in order to get your liquor license renewed, you need to hire a specific firm. And that firm was run behind the scenes by Abe Royf. And so all of a sudden, Burns's men now have evidence. More people start to talk. And Royf realizes that he is now in trouble for the first time. He had gone from being invulnerable to extremely vulnerable in less than a year. So what he decided to do, was to deflect attention by doing what today's Republican Party has decided to do. Take aim at a helpless, vulnerable minority that you can arouse public anger against with a lot of false charges. And where today's Republican Party had targeted transgender youth, Royf targeted also youth, Japanese children going to white schools in San Francisco. And what he did, remember Plessy versus Ferguson, based on separate but equal, he put a stooge in, an old painter, to be head of the Board of Education, and they were going to take the Japanese children who are polluting white society and force them into the Oriental school. And he thought this was going to deflect all the attention and keep him in business. What was interesting about it is that at the time, there were 25,000 school-age children in San Francisco, of which the number of Japanese children who would be taken out was 96. And some of them were overage, so it was basically 40 kids. And he thought, so what, it'll work. Well, unfortunately, Royf once again miscalculated, because in Japan, when word came to them, they took this as a national insult. And Japan was no weak power. They had just finished destroying the Russian army and navy at Tsushima Strait in 1905. They just obliterated the Russian navy, and the militarists in Japan started saying, this is a stand on our honor. We have just defeated the Russian navy. Let's do the United States Navy next. And Teddy Roosevelt in Washington is furious because he knows, now the Japanese government really didn't want to go to war, but there was a strong military presence in the government that did. And Teddy Roosevelt knew that they weren't kidding. These were not people to be trifled with. So he summons a delegation to go to Washington from the Board of Education. He does not invite Schmitz, who he dismisses as a bassoon player. Schmitz took umbrage at that because he was considered a violinist. But Schmitz shoehorns his way into the delegation, and they go to Washington. Now, Schmitz is they're right on the verge of being indicted at this point. So Teddy Roosevelt has to sit with a guy who's going to soon be a convicted felon and negotiate to try to get this idiotic rule reversed. And they came to an agreement. And the agreement was that if the Japanese government would agree not to allow any more low-end laborers to immigrate to the United States, that San Francisco would let the Japanese children back into the white schools. And the Japanese government went along with that. Roosevelt knew we could never get a treaty passed, so they did this as a kind of informal arrangement, which came to be known as the Gentleman's Agreement. And for the white supremacists, this seemed, okay, this is the best we were going to do. But unfortunately, again, there's a lot of gang that couldn't shoot straight in this with these people trying to stop immigration. Well, here's another one. According to the Gentleman's Agreement, if a woman in Japan was married to a man who was in the United States, she could join him in the United States. Well, there were very few of those. The number was like 14-1 men to women here, very few women. So what the men started to do is they took photographs of themselves, pictures, and sent them to Japan. Now these were supposed to be pictures of them as they looked, but the men, being pretty slick, either sent pictures of themselves when they were young and robust looking, or sent pictures of someone different altogether. And the marriageable women in Japan would look through these pictures of all these really handsome dudes and pick one and say, I will take him as my husband. A marriage ceremony was performed in Japan without the groom, totally legal. And the women came to the United States and were let in because this was the loophole in the gentleman's agreement. So instead of ending Japanese immigration, what the gentleman's agreement succeeded in doing was supplying many wives, and they were called picture brides, by the way, many brides to many Japanese men who, as these things go, proceeded to have children. And every one of those children, because of US versus Wong Kim Ark, was an American citizen. So rather than limiting the number of Japanese that they had to worry about, they kind of ballooned it. And the white supremacists, of course, are now livid. They have been snookered yet again. And one of them is the Attorney General of California at the time, a man named Ulysses Webb. And Ulysses Webb decides to fight back. And in 1913, he writes a law called the Alien Land Law, which California adopts, which said that no alien ineligible for citizenship can own land. Now, no mention of race in it, and the Supreme Court, and the book I wrote on Plessy, Inherently Unequal, it has why this happened, but the Supreme Court in two voting rights cases in 1880 had more or less given a roadmap that if you write your law and don't specifically say you're discriminating, it will pass constitutional muster. And so the alien land law was what they call facially neutral and did not mention race at all, but said no alien ineligible for citizenship can own land. Once again, this law did not actually do what Ulysses Webb wanted it to do, because there were ways around it. You could buy land as part of a corporation. You could lease land. You could sharecrop. All of these things were totally legal under the Alien Land Law of 1913. And one of the things you could do is buy property in the name of your natural-born children, American citizens, and that was also legitimate. And in 1915, this law was tested when a man named Yukichi Harada bought a house in Riverside, California, from a white owner, and he put it in the name of his 3 children, all of whom were born here. Harada had not been born here, so he couldn't buy it in his own name. And he made sure that he had no fiduciary interest in the transfer. Webb sued. It went in 1918. It went before a California court, a judge named Craig. Webb personally prosecuted the case because it was umbrage. This was his law, and the judge basically laughed him out of court, and more or less said, if you want to win, write the law better. And so in 1920, Webb did just that. And they had the second Alien Land Law, which closed all of these loopholes. You couldn't do it before 1920 because World War I was on. You couldn't do anything about the Japanese because they were fighting with the Allies. So in 1920, the second Alien Land Law is passed. And this is where the Supreme Court comes in. There were all these provisions, leasing, corporations, buying through nominees, were illegal in this second law. Again, facially neutral. Only aliens ineligible for citizenship. Wink, wink, wink. 4 cases come to the Supreme Court in 1923, and in each of them, by unanimous vote, the Supreme Court said that every one of those provisions in the 1920 Alien Land Law were constitutional. So that really kept Japanese Americans from owning land in any way except very, very circuitously. There were 2 other cases that the court decided. One was at the end of 1923, and the other was the beginning of 1924. The first one was a Japanese man, not naturally born, named Takeo Ozawa, who was in Hawaii, who worked for white employers, lived in a white neighborhood, spoke English in his home with his family, was a Christian, went to church, had testimonials from everybody saying this is the picture book, the picture book American citizen. Ozawa wrote his own brief in which he said, Benedict Arnold may look like an American, but in his heart he was a traitor. I may not look like an American, but in my heart I am. And it went to the Supreme Court. And in another unanimous decision, the opinion by Justice Sutherland, who was also an immigrant, but he had been born in one of those good countries, Scotland, ruled that, sorry, Harada said, as Ayup had, I look white. I am pale-skinned. He said, nope, the science, we have to go back to the science. Science said that you are not white, and therefore you cannot be naturalized. Okay, that kind of goes with precedent. 3 months later, there is another case. A Sikh, Bhagat Singh Thind, who had not been born here, came here, worked, joined the American Army in World War I. There are pictures of him in uniform, in a turban. After he is discharged, he applies for citizenship. He is accepted. He is sworn in as a citizen. They find out and revoke the citizenship. He's in Washington State, goes to Oregon, is sworn in as a citizen again. The citizenship is revoked again, and he goes to the United States Supreme Court. And his case was, yes, I know I am dark-skinned, but I am a Sikh, a high caste Hindu, as he put it, and we can trace our lineage back. We are Caucasian. We are scientifically white. And the court once more, Justice Sutherland writing the opinion, said, it doesn't really matter what science said, you can't be naturalized because you don't look white. So in the Ozawa case, he can't be naturalized even though he looks white because science says he's not white. And in the Thind case, it doesn't matter what science said because he doesn't look white. And so that brought in, there was a kind of status quo where Japan, over the next 15 years or so, Japan is becoming much more militaristic. And the Japanese Americans are becoming much more assimilated. They want to be, they become just intertwined with American society in a way that should have been invisible to everyone, but of course wasn't, because the newspapers are still beating the drums about that they are secretly agents of the Japanese army, and that the Japanese fishermen are actually Japanese naval officers, and they're waiting for an invasion. They're waiting for a signal to have an invasion, and then there was one cross current, and that was that in Japan in the 1930s there was an American institution that caught on, and it caught on in such a way that the militarists were furious, and that institution was baseball. Because in 1931, in American, there had been a team in 1912 from University of Chicago, but in 1931, under Lefty O'Doul, who's pretty famous out here as a San Francisco Seals, organized an all-star team to go to Japan. But in 1934, they had a real team. And 500,000 Japanese turned out to see the arrival of what they called Babu Rusu, Babe Ruth. They ripped his clothes, and baseball was, and the Japanese team came to tour here also, by the way. But this infuriated the militarists. And in fact, the Japanese man, who's a newspaper owner, who organized the 1934 tour, was attacked by a young military student with a sword, and who tried to decapitate him. But the newspaper owner, was a judo master, and he was wounded, but he survived, and I don't know what happened to the soldier. But in any event, so you have this situation where Japan is becoming more militaristic, and the Japanese Americans in this country are becoming totally American. And then, of course, you have Pearl Harbor. So all the white supremacists, all the racists, they can say, see, we told you, it was inevitable. Now, what was interesting was that the initial reaction after Pearl Harbor in a lot of West Coast newspapers was, and even by the California governor, was very tolerant. Said, these are our neighbors. These are not the people who attacked us. We need to deal with these people, not in not in the way that the racists want us to. But that didn't last very long, and very quickly the movement started that the Japanese were, in fact, they were here, they were secretly military officers, all the same hooey. And the Hearst and McClatchy newspapers were drumming this up constantly. And unfortunately, the military officer in charge of the West Coast and Western Command was a man named John DeWitt, General John DeWitt, who was a horrific bigot and probably something of a moron. His second in command was Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who Barbara Tuchman wrote about in his great book, Stilwell and the American Experience in China. And Stilwell, in a note, called DeWitt a jackass. But Stilwell was reassigned, and they brought in another second in command, a man named Carl Benditson. And Benditson was so dishonest about his past that he was the George Santos of his day. And he was incredibly bigoted. And he and DeWitt started petitioning Washington to, we've got to do something about the Japanese. We've got to get them off the West Coast. They're all secret agents. And Roosevelt had had studies done that said the Japanese are absolutely no threat. They're, if anything, more patriotic than the white people on the West Coast. But the man who turned the tide was Earl Warren, who was also at the time Attorney General of California. And what he did was he commissioned a map. And this map showed all the locations of all the vital military installations, all the vital civilian installations, and then he plotted where all the Japanese people lived. And whoa, what do you know? There wasn't a civilian or vital military installation where some Japanese people didn't live. Of course, everyone else lived there too, and he had defined this so loosely that that the dots would have more or less come together. But Warren's map turned the tide, and Roosevelt in February signed Executive Order 9066. He felt he had no choice, which authorized the internment, which DeWitt carried out with gusto. And so we come then, now we are back to Korematsu. So for me, hearing this story, you see why the decision in Korematsu, which by the way it was a 6-3 decision with two ferocious dissents, one of them by Robert Jackson, who would soon leave and become lead prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. Two ferocious dissents, but prejudice had become so ingrained, so normal, so accepted. If you say something long enough, a lot of people will believe it, even smart people who aren't prone to these kinds of feelings. So Korematsu, the decision became more or less inevitable. And the irony, of course, it's in December 1944, and within 3 months, all the camps were going to be closed anyway. But this to me is the story of how we got there. And for me, the story of how you get there is as important as where you are. Now, the story has an unfortunate postscript. In 2017, in the case of Trump v. Hawaii, the Supreme Court ruled on an executive order that every 6-year-old knew was aimed at Muslims. And it was aimed at Muslims for political reasons. Muslims are all terrorists or whatever it was. This was Trump drumming up his base. And the court upheld that edict. And in his decision, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, Korematsu has nothing to do with this case because Korematsu was a racist decision. This is based on national security. Well, I wish Justice Roberts was in Brooklyn because I could sell him a bridge. But this was an atrocious extension of an atrocious decision. So for me, what the saddest part is that bigotry is still a story that doesn't have an ending.
Whether we may be moving toward something similar when it comes to Chinese students and professors in the United States in light of the concerns about China that have been expressed and seem to be apolitical. Everybody now seems to fear
That's a good question. Um, if you take the long view, like 500 years, there is no question that we as a species have moved forward. Uh, but it's not straight line. And things that were totally commonplace, slavery was accepted around the world, people were burned at the stake. There were levels of oppression that most of the world will not tolerate anymore. On the other hand, every time one thinks that we've actually made a lot of progress, we slip back. So there is this sense, I guess, to answer you, I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is the fight never ends. That you can never. I still remember George Bush Sr. talked about the New World Order. Well, the New World Order lasted about as long as the phrase could come out of his mouth, because there is no New World Order in that sense. We are always, we are a flawed species, and we tend toward behavior that we're not always proud of in retrospect. And I guess it's important to look back and not look back and go, look what they did, we're better than that. Well, maybe a little, but not entirely. In terms of Asian Americans, um, it's going to be difficult. In terms of people coming from China to want to study or want to do business, there are legitimate concerns because it is now an authoritarian government. But as for the people here, will they be subjected to increased bigotry? Sadly, almost inevitably. But it's got to be people like the people in this room that don't let it happen.
Could you give us a brief postscript of what happened to Fred Korematsu and the three other contemporaneous cases that included an apology from President Ford and the awarding of a Presidential Medal of Freedom, either from President Clinton and President Obama?
There were 4 cases. There was a lawyer named Min Yasui, a Quaker named Gordon Hirabayashi, Fred Korematsu, and a woman named Masui Endo. And each of them, the Matsui and Hirabashi cases, were not about violating the order. They violated the curfew, because before internment there was a curfew that was limited to Japanese Americans, and they intentionally stayed out late. In fact, I think it was either Matsui or Hirabayashi who actually walked into the police station and demanded to be arrested. Hirabashi, thank you. And so those 2 cases were decided earlier, but that was a simple. There were dissents in that, but those cases were decided just on breaking curfew. Matsui Endo was an employee of the Department of Motor Vehicles here, and she was fired from her job even though they had done a security check of her and found her to be completely loyal. And then they tried to make a deal with her, but eventually she was sent to Tule Lake, which was the worst of the camps, and they offered to let her out, and she refused. And Fred Korematsu, whose name is on the case we all know, was the simplest. He violated the internment order because he had an Italian girlfriend, and he didn't want to leave his girlfriend. He even went to a plastic surgeon and had some surgery done so he could look more white. But he was eventually caught and sent to sent to the internment camps. After the war, Yasui became a lawyer. Hirabayashi was a sociology professor, I believe. He went to Canada. Sui Endo she more or less disappeared. And in fact, decades later, her daughter was stunned to find out that she had been the party to one of the cases. And Fred Korematsu basically lived out, he was just kind of this, ambling guy who wanted to be with his girl, who disowned him, obviously. And he became an activist to a point, but he lived a relatively normal life. And I think they've all passed away by now, but I do think it was President Obama who awarded the Medal of Freedom posthumously, I think, to Matsui and Hirabayashi. I think Fred Korematsu is still alive. I'm not really sure about that. But, and the other thing was, by the way, that eventually reparations were awarded, and every Japanese American who was interned got $20,000, which is the precedent for the movement for reparations for Black people, which will be a lot more than $20,000 and a lot more people involved.
Do you think, in retrospect, how Warren processed what he did and how it affected him when he did become Chief Justice?
Good question. There is a report that after the war was over, he was driving, he asked his driver to pull over on the side, and he broke into tears. And he said, now, this could be apocryphal, but it may well have happened, that he regretted it, that he knew he had done something terrible. Now, did that impact him in Brown versus Board? There is no way to know for certain, but I would bet that it did, because when you do something like that, even if he didn't break down in tears, he definitely went on record and with deep regret for what he had done. And I think that Brown v. Board may well have been a result of Warren, because before Warren he was in World War I, he got out, he joined the Native Sons of the Golden West, which was a horrifically racist organization. Warren, this didn't come from nowhere in 1942 when he had the map drawn. This was the end of a long period of anti-Asian racism. And I think he learned his lesson, which is, it's one of the great things about Lincoln. Lincoln initially he favored sending all Black people, freed slaves, to Africa. But the thing that made Lincoln so great was that Lincoln learned. Lincoln was capable of growth. So should we all be. And that Earl Warren was capable of growth, and one just hopes that the country will also be capable of growth.
I just would like you to comment on the evidence that was withheld by the Defense Department in the cases, and how that ultimately came to be exposed and affected subsequent cases before the Supreme Court.
Well, Roosevelt had sent spies, civilians, to both the West and to Hawaii, and that's where he got the reports that all these racist pronouncements were baseless. That there was no threat from Japanese Americans, no threat from any Japanese person living in the country, and that was. Obviously, after the internment started, a lot of that stuff was suppressed, and it came out afterwards. And I believe Peter Irons was one of the people. It was before the Freedom of Information Act, even, I believe. But they dug into the records, and they found all of this exculpatory evidence that all of these decisions had been made based on spurious information or outright lies. DeWitt went on to a terrific career. I think he was made commandant at West Point, and he was promoted. And Benditson also did remarkably well. So the villains were never dealt with in the way they should have been, but the evidence ultimately came out, and how it affected other Supreme Court cases, that I'm not certain. Thank you. This is great. We can keep asking another question, and then you guys can keep applauding. Hey, thank you all very much. I hope you had as much fun as I did.